Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel on the global economy. The goal of our discussion in the next hour is to provide a global economic outlook for 2024. In today's rapidly evolving international landscape, the world has been witnessing a dynamic and an intense global competition among great powers. This competition has been marked by strategic maneuvering, technological advancements, and military assertiveness. The United States and China find themselves locked in a contest for influence and access in strategic regions such as the Middle East and North Africa, where both countries are seeking to secure vital energy resources and foster economic partnerships. Russia and China are also forging closer ties, cooperating in areas such as trade, technology, and security, and challenging traditional geopolitical alignments. And over the past 4 months, the devastating war on Gaza has shaped the global power dynamics, reshaping strategies and calculations among the great powers in the world. The war is also affecting neighboring countries in the MENA region that have also been confronted by serious financial challenges and soaring levels of debt as a result of deeply structural economic weaknesses, as well as adverse external shocks that hit the global economy, like the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So to discuss in greater depth all these issues and others, we're very happy to have our 4 esteemed panelists with us today. So we have Mr. Jihad Azrour, who is the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF, where he oversees the fund's work on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. We also have Mr. Marwan Mashar, who is the vice president for studies at Carnegie. He oversees research in Washington and Beirut, and he previously served as foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Jordan. We're also very happy to have Mr. Yukon Huang, a senior fellow in the Carnegie Asia program, where his research focuses on China's economy and its regional and global impact. And last but not least, we have Ms. Haneen El Sayed, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and an economic development professional with more than 25 years of experience at the World Bank. And I am Noura Arafeh. I'm a fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center. I work on the political economy of the Middle East and on Palestinian-Israeli affairs, and I will be moderating today's panel. So let me begin with a question for Mr. Jihad Azrour, specifically on the war in Gaza, because the IMF published today a report with an update to on the economic outlook for the MENA region. So Mr. Jihad Azrour, how do you foresee the impact of the war on Gaza on global and regional economics? And given the recent escalation of tensions in the Red Sea as a result of the Houthi attacks on ships and the responses from the US and the UK, how do you anticipate these developments will impact the web of global trade relations, particularly in some key industries? You're muted, Mr. Jihad.
I think
we can hear you now.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Noor, and great to be with you and with the other colleagues. Clearly, this year is an exceptional year for any economist to read through. It's a tale of two cities. We have developments that are dramatic in certain countries, but not so for others. We have high level of uncertainty that is going to cast a shadow on the region, and risks are extremely high. What does it mean practically? One, in terms of the impact of the conflict economically, we have the epicenter and the adjacent countries who are the most affected groups. The epicenter, which is Palestine, is going through a huge set of hardships and damages, in addition to the loss of human lives, in addition to the very dire humanitarian situation the economy has faced and is facing a tremendous impact of the shock. We expect the economy in 2023 to shrink with negative growth of 6%, and this compared to 3% growth that was expected, which means 9% adjustment. And this is something that would require to be revised, especially if the conflict is to extend. The neighboring countries, the immediate neighboring countries have been affected. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt, though differently. The main channels of impact were trade, were also tourism, financial impact, and oil and gas. Definitely the adjacent countries are at the risk of further impact if the conflict is to extend. But by and large, those economies will be affected by a drop in growth by 0.6 to 0.4%. Beyond that, the picture is different. And the channels of communication are going to define how countries will be affected. Of course, in the beginning, everybody was focused on oil and gas. That proved to be more resilient. Trade is the challenge, especially with the uncertainty we see on the Red Sea that has led to a drop in volume of trade as well as also in the cost of trade and predictability of trade. What does it mean for 2024? We will see the level of uncertainty casting a shadow on the outlook for neighboring countries. We are seeing more specific impact for certain sectors, especially those that are related to trade, to value chains. We saw in the beginning some volatility on the financial markets, but it receded. In addition to the uncertainty, I think the impact globally is going to be limited so far. And this depends on the nature of the conflict and the way the conflict is going to expand. The impact globally on growth was almost muted. The impact on the oil and gas market was short-lived. And this is due to the existence of at least 8 million barrels of spare capacity and also the capacity of the supply to be channeled from other sources. What does it mean for the region? What does it mean for the world? For the region, it means one has to be extremely vigilant because the risks of expansion of the conflict will have an impact on the region. One has to be also very vigilant that there are short-term impact of this war, but there are also long-term transformative impact of this war that one has to start assessing and mobilizing resources to address them. One has also to look at the weaknesses that were exacerbated by the shock and the need for any reconstruction to take into consideration the regional dynamic and how to address those long-standing issues. And also, one has to look at risks of escalation and the way that this could transmit to a wider set of countries or to a certain number of economic activities. For the time being, trade is the most affected one, but there are still risks on the oil and gas market. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. So moving on to China, which has become the leading trade partner for over 120 countries, including the EU, Africa, and the MENA region. Amid rising political and economic tensions between the US and China, many countries find themselves in a delicate position in navigating their partnerships with these two countries. So, Mr. Yukon Huang, what do you think are the implications of the US-China tensions and trade war on global markets? And which countries do you think stand to benefit from the US-China trade and tech wars? And which countries do you think will be hurt economically by this rivalry, and how?
Thank you very much, Noor. Please, thank you for having me here today. Let's go back 4 or 5 years. When President Trump launched the trade war, he was fixated on growing U.S. deficits. He wanted to increase more manufacturing at home. And he basically levied tariffs around both in Europe, China, around the world. He also started to implement restrictions on investment technology transfers. President Biden has maintained these tariffs. He's reinforced these trade and investment restrictions. And we can look today to see what the consequences are. America's trade deficit with China, in fact, has not changed. But what has changed is the pattern of trade. And these tariffs, the tariffs which were launched, have actually increased inflation in the United States. It's reduced the competitiveness of U.S. firms. America's dependency on manufactured imports has actually increased. But the pattern of trade has changed. If you look at America's increased imports of manufactured goods over the last 4 or 5 years, it's increased by about $700 billion. Of that $700 billion increase, less than 5% of that has been provided by China. And China normally would have provided about 25%. It actually only provided about 5%. The increased imports of manufactured goods coming into the United States is now coming from a range of other countries. Most notably, America's major trading partners in North America, that is essentially Mexico and Canada. In Asia, the bulk has come from Vietnam, but also from South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan, India. Even in Europe, the major beneficiary of increased exports to the United States of manufactured goods is Germany. So China's direct trade with the United States has been reduced as a share. But these countries, this handful of 5, 6, 7, 8 countries whose exports to the United States have surged, they've been able to provide these exports primarily by importing more components and parts and materials from China. So China's share of global exports has surged. So we can actually conclude that while America's dependency on China in terms of trade has declined, the direct dependency, its indirect dependency upon China has actually increased. So China's share of global exports as well as manufacturing has surged. But there's also been a consequence in terms of supply chain. The pandemic, increased security concerns, has started a process of reorienting supply chains, diversification, regionalization, less dependency upon China, less foreign investment flows going to China and Asia more generally in some ways. This has increased costs and efficiencies. So although countries can maintain what I would call a trade dominance, such as China or even Germany, growth prospects has actually declined. So China has been undergoing a long-term decline in growth, but this impact is also seen in other countries, even countries which have benefited from the trade or tariff war. Mexico, for example, the economy has stagnated. So has Germany. Cost inefficiencies have increased. So this trade war and the technology war that's basically followed has not actually benefited the global economy. In the short term, we tend to look at the consequences on Asia and China in particular, but there are also long-term consequences on the United States. The technology war, the reduced restrictions on U.S. exports of high-tech components to China, has reduced the earnings of U.S. high-tech companies, and in the long term reduces their funding for research and development. It will also damage America's innovative prospects. So in the short term, China's growth has been damaged, but in the longer term, there is a consequence also in the United States. There is a tendency to look at the changes in terms of the trade war, regional conflicts, rising debt, climate change on short-term growth prospects. So the fund and the World Bank have come out with their forecast for the economy for next year and beyond, and they're modest changes. Some countries are doing worse, some countries are doing better. In particular, the U.S. economy is likely to decline a little bit. China will continue to slow down. Germany will rebound from its stagnation of this past year. There will be growth in some developing countries, but slower growth in other countries. But what is really important is, I think, the long-term consequences. We are entering a period where potentially global growth will slow down. Growth is determined in the long term essentially by investment levels and increases or changes in productivity. Investment per capita, global growth in investment per capita will only be about half of what it was a decade and a half ago. Productivity, the returns to investment have fallen, so has labor productivity. So we're entering a period where long-term growth is likely to be damaged, and it will likely be maybe perhaps as much as 1% lower than it was a decade ago. So I think this is the long-term consequences of the trade war, and it's been amplified by the regional conflicts and growing concerns about climate change and aging. Let me stop here, please.
Thank you so much for these insights about the implications of the trade and tech war on the global economy. So I want us to move to focus on the MENA region for a bit, because low and middle income countries in the MENA region, as I mentioned in my introduction, have been confronted by very serious financial challenges, which were compounded by the that and the food crises that hit the region. So, Mr. Marwan Mashir, I'd like to ask you, how are these countries managing the different crises and considering distributing the burden of adjustment internally? And how are political calculations shaping the choice of reform strategies and their feasibility in these countries?
Thank you, Noor. Let me also, as Yukon did, go back a few years and look at the different and successive crises that have hit the region since at least 2010, starting with the Arab uprisings, moving through the decline in oil prices in 2014, the Russia-Ukraine war, Corona, the food and debt and inflation problems hitting the region. All of these have not started the economic crisis that the region is in today, but have deepened it substantially. And today it has divided the Arab world into at least three categories of countries. Those that are thriving, those that are struggling, and those that are failing. I like to jokingly say it's like the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the oil importing states are basically the ones in the second category, in the struggling category. They have relied on oil income coming from Gulf countries for far too long. Oil income not just in the form of subsidies or grants coming from these countries, but also in the form of remittances, in the form of investments coming from these countries. And because of the drop in oil prices and the change in the economic, in the aid model that Gulf countries are adopting now, these countries can no longer rely on basically a patronage economy, which benefits a great deal from oil revenues. Even while we are witnessing today a resurge in oil prices because of the Russia-Ukraine war, in the long term, I believe that we are starting, a post-oil era in the Arab world. And that post-oil era requires oil importing countries in particular to take measures, not in an ad hoc manner, but in a holistic fashion that I don't believe they are taking today. Debt has really soared, and these countries, in order to deal with the loss of revenue that was coming from the Gulf, have resorted to debt. Today, Egypt is in a very precarious situation because of that. Debt has soared in Egypt. Countries like Jordan or Tunisia can no longer depend on the same level of remittances, can no longer depend on the same level of aid. And yet what we are seeing in the region is a series of ad hoc measures, in my view, that attempt to manage the crisis, but does not really look at the long-term effects and try to address them. The Gulf, the thriving countries, because of oil, have started to adopt serious economic and social reforms. Oil importing countries are trying some economic reforms, but as I said, in an ad hoc manner. And then you have the third category of failed states, which are doing nothing. these are the Lebanon, the Syria, the Libyas, the Yemens, the Sudans of the region, in which no matter how bad the situation is, their capacity to engage in serious reforms is extremely limited because of political considerations. We'll address, if you want, Noor, what we need to do, a bit later in terms of migrating from an Arab economic order, which is today dead, the old order, which has depended on oil to a great extent, and which has resulted in the development of a patronage system that is not productive, and that has resulted, of course, in the lack of political good governance. That system is about to die because of the decreasing importance of oil in the region. But migrating to a new system is going to be extremely challenging for countries that have not been used to look at reform in any holistic way. And I can talk about this later. I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So this view that you gave us of the economic system in the MENA region is actually very much linked to the social outlook in the MENA, where I'd like to which I would like to discuss more with Ms. Haneen Al-Sayed, because a lot of progress that has been made on poverty reduction in the MENA region has been stopped as a result of the different crises that hit the region, and youth unemployment has been on the rise. So can you tell us more, Haneen, about the state of poverty and labor markets in the region? And what are the implications of high unemployment and poverty rates on development prospects in the short run and in the long run?
Thank you very much, Noor. So let me begin briefly with the global picture, as colleagues have done, and basically to say that unfortunately, the progress in reducing poverty globally has virtually come to a halt in the aftermath of the series of extraordinary shocks to the global economy that started with COVID-19 and then continued with rising food and energy prices, the climate shocks, and the conflict among the world's biggest food producers. So COVID-19 dealt the biggest setback to global poverty in decades. It's basically put another 70 million people under extreme poverty, bringing that number to more than 700 million. And if we look at those under the poverty line of $7 a day, which is not the extreme poverty, but it is poverty, we're talking about half the world's population, nearly 3 billion people. But also global income inequality has risen for the first time in decades, and this is very worrying. Incomes of the poorest countries fell much more than incomes in the rich countries, and the economic recovery from COVID was uneven as the richest countries recovered at a much faster pace than the low and middle income countries. So basically, income losses of the poorest 40% of the world's population were twice as high as those of the richest 20%. And this has to do with many factors, including preparedness into crises, systems, access to finance, and among other policies that countries entered COVID with. Now, coming to MENA, while it's not the region with the highest poverty rates or headcounts in the world, it actually comes after Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but it's the only region where poverty has been increasing since 2014. And if we take even a longer view of about 30 years, between 1990 and 2019, right before COVID, poverty fell in all regions in the world except for MENA. So something really not good is happening. Today, we have about 30 million people in MENA who are under the poverty line, and this is expected to stay high unless there's some major shift in policy conditions, and we can talk about that later. Now, one of the things which underlies really this increase in poverty and sort of persistent is what we call labor market exclusion, which in MENA is widespread. And here I'm talking about limited work opportunities, especially for women and youth, and the fact that most workers are engaged in low productivity informal jobs. And we've seen that in COVID, where many jobs were lost, and informality rose very high. So today, the labor force participation rate in MENA is the lowest since 1991. And we have 3.3 million people who basically dropped out of the labor force since 2019. Again, very, very critical. Now, turning to the state of human capital in MENA, this has basically gone from bad to worse. Human capital, as measured actually by World Bank Human Capital Index, is a conglomeration of health outcomes, knowledge, skills attainments throughout a lifetime of an individual. And using that measure, there's been further setbacks, especially for the poor, in health outcomes and education attainment. We've seen a rise in premature mortality, pronounced learning losses. In MENA schools, for example, closures were almost 200 days during the critical year of COVID. And then conflict in our region is severely eroding human capital as displaced people lose access to employment, to schooling, to healthcare, to nutrition. Let's not forget that today we have about 16 million internally displaced persons in the MENA region as of the end of 2022, and this is not including what happened 2023 and what we hope will not happen in 2024. So I want to highlight now quickly some of the relationship between macroeconomic imbalances, particularly inflation, on human capital. This needs further kind of highlighting. And drawing upon recent World Bank research, which showed that there are serious long-term effects of rising prices, especially food prices, on human capital. And that's even if there were temporary price increases. So rising food prices in MENA, by the estimate of this World Bank research, which came out about a year ago, of let's say 4 months alone, increased the risk of child stunting. Now, child stunting, this is a ratio of height for age. It increased that ratio by 17 to 24%. That is about 200 to 280,000 more newborns are at risk of child stunting. Now, stunting is bad by itself, but it also, we know from a lot of evidence that it's associated with many other negative outcomes, particularly lower school performance and attainment. And this, of course, will lower the income prospects of the individual, household, and then ultimately the economy. And also inflation contributes to food insecurity, a big issue in MENA, which has risen, the food insecurity has risen extremely in the region. Of course, hotspots are Syria and Yemen, and now Gaza, but also other MENA countries, including Lebanon, Jordan, even Oman, are underperforming in terms of food security compared to their income peers. So today, nearly 8 million children are forecast to be food insecure in 2023. And this is before Gaza. So I'm just giving, how critical the setbacks, which come, of course, from growth and inflation and a lot of the macro issues that have been discussed, how critical they are for human capital, and how these setbacks are big, and if left unaddressed by policy, they really have long-term serious and negative consequences for future generation. And really, the cost of inaction today is is much higher in the future. So we'll discuss some of these policy options in the second segment.
Thank you so much, Haneen. As you just concluded, it's a gloomy picture, but it reminds us of the importance of undertaking serious and substantial economic, social, and political reforms in the MENA region. So far, as part of this panel, we discussed like the effects of the Gaza war on regional markets. We talked about China-US rivalry and its short-term and long-term impacts on growth. We discussed the politics of economic reform and the social outlook globally and for the MENA region. Now, I want us to move and focus on another key development that happened in 2023 and that will also keep on happening in 2024 regarding BRICS. So many countries, including countries in the MENA region and in Africa, have shown interest in increasing partnerships with non-Western economies and alliances, especially BRICS, with now the expansion of BRICS countries to include other countries from MENA and Africa. So Mr. Jihad Azrour, I'd like to ask you about the global economic, monetary, and geopolitical implications of this BRICS expansion. And how do you think will this expansion shape global governance?
Noor, it's an important issue. I think the BRICS is not a new development. It has been there for more than 2 decades. What is new in it is this: it comes in the context of rising geopolitical tension that is leading to economic fragmentation. The emergence of concepts like the new global south and those groupings are more perceived today as ways to increase barriers than to extend cooperation. And at the beginning of 2024, I think one has to think about 3 elements that are going to shape the global coordination or cooperation. One is the geopolitical tension in a context where this year is going to be very charged politically with elections that could have an impact on global cooperation. 2, the transformative trends. I think the colleagues raised some of those. Climate change, and for the region, the whole process of transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. Technology and the acceleration of technological trends. And the 3rd transformative change is the lack of productivity that needs to be addressed in a context where the growth in the global economy is below what its potential and below what it was a couple of decades ago. Those are big transformative trends, in addition to the shocks. There are several shocks. One of them was the war in Ukraine and recently the war in Gaza. Those are somehow shaping up how the global economy is reacting to those and how the global coordination is taking shape. When it comes to the region, what one could say is we saw recently an increased interest in developing new linkages, not only with the BRICS, but also with Africa, with Central Asia, with China, whereby we saw the emergence of new partnership opportunities. In a fragmented world, regions like ours could also not only face or be subjected to the negative impact of it, but also could benefit from it. And we see certain number of economies trying to, in fact, to cater for becoming hubs for those kind of developments. What does it mean? It means that today, if the issue of coordination and cooperation is not addressed, this will have a negative impact on growth, and this has been demonstrated. 2, for a region like ours, where we have a deficit in job creation, that is one of the inherited problem. If we are not able to create additional growth, it's very difficult for us to address the inclusion issue, because inclusion has to translate into opportunities, has to translate into jobs, has to translate into increase of access. Therefore, again, I think we are at a moment where we need to look at all these transformations from a global perspective to see how those key geopolitical and geoeconomic questions are going to shape up coordination, competition, and the impact of that on increasing the size of the global economy. 2, when it comes to the region, is to understand all these big transformations and to make sure that we have a place in it. But more importantly, and also to understand how the recent shocks, the war in Ukraine and Russia, and the recent one that is taking place at the center of the region, would require to have certain number of policies and also accelerating some of the reforms that will allow the region to at least overcome those challenges and to benefit from any opportunities that could be created. The good news is we see certain number of initiatives taking place or certain number of countries moving in this direction. Those are bright spots, need to be expanded and entrenched. Expanded to benefit other countries, and this is also what required to rethink the way regional cooperation can happen, but also to entrench it, because if it doesn't translate into additional job opportunities, especially for the youth that are suffering from one of the highest level of unemployment. If there is one issue to address in the region is employment. And if there is one priority is to create job and increase inclusion of women, the rest should support that. Therefore, I think we are in the beginning of this 2024 at one of those transformative moments at crossroad where we need to deal with more than one issue at the time. And the fact that the region is interested to join the BRICS or other groupings, this is something that is welcome, provided that this will provide more opportunities to the region to be more integrated in the global economy.
Thank you so much. So a related geopolitical and geoeconomic question I'd like us to discuss is the confidence in the US dollar, which has been the subject of many discussions in 2023, with the currency reaching its lowest index in July 2023 since April 2022. And this opened room to question the long-term value of the currency. And at the same time, we have been witnessing a push towards the use of local currencies as alternatives to the US dollar in bilateral trade, especially in the aftermath of the war on Ukraine. So, Mr. Yukon Huang, I'd like us to discuss this together. Do you think the global economy might be heading towards de-dollarization? And if so, what do you think are the potential benefits and drawbacks of de-dollarization for different regions in the world?
Thank you very much. The US dollar has been the dominant global currency ever since World War II. And more recently, concerns have been raised about whether the rise of the RMB could actually displace the dollar as the dominant global currency. There's a desire among many countries to look for alternatives, to diversify options, to rely less on the dollar, whether it means supporting the SDR, the IMF current unit as a global currency, or going for digital currencies, or even cryptocurrencies. But the most serious change, I think, over the last few years has been the rise of the RMB, both as a trading currency, its use potentially in trade of key energy resources such as oil, or as an alternative to the SWIFT cross-border payment systems. So what is driving the desire for countries to seek alternatives? In China's case, it's really a question of security. The role of the US dollar as the global currency gives the United States and the West unlimited power in some sense in terms of sanctioning countries such as North Korea or Iran. And of course, China worries greatly that there may be a time when the sanctioning of the dollar will be applied against China. And given its reliance on the global economic system, this would be a major issue. If you want to judge whether or not alternatives are really possible, we have to look at what I would call two kinds of thresholds. Can the digital currencies or can the RMB replace the dollar in terms of reserves as a dominant unit for trade? That's the major hurdle. The second one would be a lower threshold. Can, for example, the RMB increase its use as a major trading currency? In that sense, it's actually happening. For the first question, the answer to the first question is it would take what I call a momentous change in global economic relationships and payment systems for the US dollar to be replaced by something else. you'd have to lose total confidence in the dollar. There has been some concern about that question vis-a-vis the debt crisis or the raising of the debt ceiling issues in the United States in recent years. And that's raised questions about the reliability about the US dollar. But all things said, it's highly unlikely that the dollar could actually be replaced as the global currency in the foreseeable future. But as a major trading currency, the RMB has been increasing. It's been increasing because China is the dominant trading nation. It's the major trading partner with over 100 countries. It's using increasing use of the RMB and its Belt and Road Initiative through its loan programs. It has raised the question of replacing the dollar as the key currency in terms of trade of oil, and has done so with Russia. It's made a request with Saudi Arabia to conduct its trade in oil and gas in renminbi rather than dollars, and that's still pending. It's created an alternative global payment system to the SWIFT system, which is denominated in dollars. China's proposal is for what has been called a CIPS, a cross-border interbank payment system. And that has drawn some interest, but it still has not been significant. And even major Chinese banks still rely upon the SWIFT system. So we don't see really a likelihood of the renminbi becoming a dominant currency, but its increased use is occurring. But it's occurring primarily in terms of bilateral trade between China and other countries. So increasingly, you see trade between China with advanced countries as well as developing countries denominated in RMB. Even the trade, for example, with Britain, UK, China trade, as much as a third of the trade has been denominated in RMB in recent years. So it is increasing. But there's very little use of the RMB in terms of trade among advanced countries and between developing countries that does not involve China. So for all practical purposes, it's largely a trading currency used when trade is done with China, but not when China is not involved. If we ask the general question, is it likely that some other currency, particularly the RMB, could become a global currency? There are some technical constraints to the rise of the RMB as a global currency. We have to go back 70 years to ask, how did the dollar become the global currency? Well, it became the global currency because the US has been running trade deficits for decades. And when it runs trade deficits, it pays its creditors in dollars. So there's a lot of dollars out there because of US trade deficits and the desired willingness of foreign creditors to hold dollars. The second thing that occurred, particularly after World War II, was the use of the dollar as a currency in terms of foreign aid. So massive foreign aid programs involving the United States aid to Europe, to developing countries, denominated in dollars, poured another huge amount of dollars into the global system. Now let's go back and look at China. China does not run trade deficits. It runs trade surpluses. So it accumulates dollars rather than giving more RMB to the global system. China's foreign aid is not denominated, it's not a grant program, it's a loan program. So the BRI program, for example, aid to countries have to be repaid. It doesn't therefore end up with a large surplus of RMB in the global economy. So for all practical purposes, also, China's domestic financial market is closed. It's not open. It's not reliable. So for all practical considerations, it's highly unlikely that the RMB, or for that matter, any other artificially created currency, could become the global currency in the foreseeable future. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much for these important insights. I'd like to remind the virtual audience that you can ask any questions you have for the panelists in the chat bar. Unfortunately, Mr. Jihad Azrour will have to leave us in a couple of minutes, but we still have 15 minutes. So if you want to ask any questions to the other panelists, please do so. So I want us now to move to shift the focus to the MENA region. And Mr. Marwan Mashar, you spoke before about how the Arab economic order, the old one, has been contested and that it can no longer survive. And so I'd like us to ask you to elaborate more on this and talk more about what kind of new order or new orders the region should be heading towards. You're muted.
If we look at some of the structural problems facing the Arab world, we will, I think, agree that decades of economic reform have not done much about these structural problems. Unemployment, for example, despite decades, maybe 30, 40 years of economic reforms in Egypt, in Jordan, in Tunisia, in other places in the Arab world, unemployment has not gone down 1 point. In fact, it has soared in the last 30 years. Debt is a similar issue. And so my point is that if we are to address the structural problems that the Arab world faces economically, we have to look at reform from a holistic point of view. We can no longer look at ad hoc reforms, which we have tried before and we have failed at. Let's take unemployment as a problem. Without revamping the education sector in the Arab world, one will not be able to have the private sector lead the process of growth in Arab countries, and one would not be able to address the fact that governments can no longer employ people in the public sector the way they have done before. Governments have become inflated, and their ability to employ people made possible by oil in the past is weakening. And so you need to look at the education sector. You need to look at how you develop SMEs in the Arab world, how you change the legislative investment environment, how to include women and thereby enlarging the economies. Sorry, this is Beirut, so I just lost electricity. It will come back now. How do you enlarge the economy by addressing the issue of gender inequality that has been going on for a very long time in the Arab world? None of these issues are being looked at substantially, or they are seen as marginal to the reform process. In my view, the Arab world needs three main components if it is to migrate to a new, not just economic order, but to a new political order as well. We need political inclusion, giving the Arab citizen the feeling that they are part of the decision-making process. We need to migrate away from oil economically, diversify the economies of the region, and that can only be done if we really change the traditional model of the state in the Arab world, which is, a patronage state, a welfare state, if you will, and have the private sector lead the engine, lead growth in the region, provided, of course, you change the educational system and you change the investment environment in the region. And you need social reform in terms of gender equality and treating all citizens as equal. Today, citizens are not treated as equal in the Arab world, whether it is because of religious considerations or gender considerations or what have you. These are difficult issues to deal with, but they are no longer luxury items unless the Arab world understands that it has to approach reform in a holistic way. We are not going to come out of the hole we are in. Even Gulf states, which today are prospering because of oil prices, because of oil reserves that they have amassed over the years, and because they understood they need to do social reforms as well, and social reforms have started in Gulf states. But none of these three categories that I have mentioned before, not the thriving states or the struggling states or the failing states, are willing to understand that good governance is a necessary component towards stability and prosperity in the region. None of them are ready so far to embark on a new model of development that includes political reform as a necessary component. And unless we do that, we are just going to keep struggling with successive crises. We have had, 5 crises since 2010, starting from the Arab uprisings to the decline in oil prices, to Corona, to the Russia-Ukraine war, and now to the Gaza war, even though so far it hasn't really impacted the region economically as much as one would have thought. But unless we stop and think of our economic model and how we're going to change that, I'm afraid we will just be hit by one crisis after the other, and our ability to address these crises successfully is becoming more limited as we go. Look at what is happening in Egypt. Egypt has borrowed so heavily that today, it is barely able to service its debt. 52% of Egypt's budget today goes to debt service. That simply is not sustainable.
Thank you so much. So this actually provides a very good transition to the question I wanted to ask you, Ms. Haneen Sayed. Just building on what Marwan just said and on your overview of the state of poverty and human capital in the Arab world, what kind of reforms do you think should countries undertake to tackle poverty and develop human capital in the region, keeping in mind the high debt burdens and the growing fiscal deficits that they are currently facing?
Thank you, Noor. And yes, indeed, of course, I agree very much with what Marwan said. And let me take it, there's 2 levels. I think there needs to be a major course correction, basically, given the magnitude of the issues that we're facing at a global level and at the country level. So take the country level first. So definitely, policymakers, they need to redouble their efforts to grow their economies. I mean, the outlook that Jihad mentioned is not great, but that's got to be on policymakers' mind. But it should be with a focus on boosting the incomes of the poor. So that kind of economic growth, that inclusive growth. And that's got to be through more and better jobs, high productivity jobs, and enhancing the human capital of the poor, education, health, skills, knowledge, and so on. Now, creating more and better jobs is the job of the private sector. And yes, absolutely, we have to revitalize the private sector in the MENA region. I mean, this is not new, but this is something that we need to keep reminding policymakers of and do what is needed, including regulation and many other things to grow the private sector. But it's also about having right social protection policies and programs, those that can facilitate access to productive employment. You need social protection programs that protect workers and that provide a safety net for people who are left behind. Now, behind all of this and achieve this, fiscal policy is very important, both on the spending and the revenue side. And in all the MENA countries, there needs to be major reform of fiscal policy. We've seen, for example, during the pandemic, where fiscal policy made a big difference, a noticeable difference in reducing the pandemic's impact on poverty in the high-income countries, for example. but also in countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa, who expanded their food and cash transfer programs dramatically to cushion the impact. India, for example, was able to reach 85% of rural households with cash transfer programs during COVID. And this is the difference between those countries and MENA, where most of our countries entered COVID and these shocks unprepared. Some did quite well in terms of scaling up, like Jordan, Egypt initially, but countries like Lebanon, for example, went in totally unprepared for the multiple shocks that Lebanon had, not just COVID and food and fuel. They had no, for example, social registry, of which they knew who to reach, who the poor are, and so on. So these are very important, building the delivery systems, the institutions that are needed to face shocks. And then invest in the right places, invest in things that have long-term development outcomes. We know, for example, that investing in early childhood development is transformative and will help a country down, the economy, the whole country down the road, including programs that protect mothers, pregnant mothers, nutrition, and of course, several times gender was raised, women's labor force participation rate. We know that these things are important for long-term development. And then, of course, on the revenue side, in terms of fiscal policy, we need to mobilize more revenue, but make sure not to hurt the poor. So do it in progressive ways. There's property taxes, carbon taxes, and so on. And prepare for the next crises. I mean, this is, as I mentioned already, many of our countries went in unprepared. And in MENA, we know it's not if there's another crisis, it's simply when. So expand automatic stabilizers in the economy, for example, like employment guarantee schemes, especially when you have high informality. Set up adaptive delivery systems, as I mentioned. Invest in digital. This is absolutely critical. Invest in data production, data analysis. Most of the MENA countries were flying in the dark because the data is either outdated or doesn't exist even. So this is very important for policy and policy making. So these are at the country level, but as I mentioned, countries can't do it alone. Stepping up global cooperation is absolutely needed. It's needed to provide debt relief. It's needed to facilitate trade integration. It's needed to tackle climate change, alleviate food insecurity, and many other such global issues. So, and financing, of course. So I'll end here with basically providing this basket of policies that focus on how we can preserve human capital, let alone expand it in the coming few years.
Thank you so much, Haneen. So both you and Marwan spoke about the importance of addressing the issue of youth unemployment in the MENA region. And here I have a follow-up question to either you or Marwan, which has to do with the effects of artificial intelligence, the potential effect of increasing investment in artificial intelligence on employment in the region. Because on the one hand, we have studies showing that investment in AI will be a path towards economic growth and will increase productivity. But at the same time, there are growing concerns of the potential loss of jobs that could result from the increasing use of AI, and that it might actually increase the economic inequality in the MENA region. The MENA region, I'd like to remind the virtual audience, is the most unequal region in the world. And there are speculations that with increasing investment in artificial intelligence would mainly benefit capital owners or those high wage earners and not low wage earners. So how do you think might this shape employment in the MENA region, the high unemployment rates, and where the MENA region might be heading in the future?
I can very briefly respond to that, Noor, to say that I think technological progress like AI will always bring new and different jobs. So sure, some jobs will be lost, but new jobs will be created. We actually don't even know what they are, but they're being created as we speak. prompters for ChatGPT, for example. That's a whole other new area that's developing. But we do have to ensure that the skills that the youth have, the skills to innovate and to take on these new jobs. So this is the task of private sector and governments to work on that. So I'm a believer that with technology, productivity will go up, but we have to make sure that the people have the right skills, especially the lower income and the poor households.
Noor, let me just add
Please.
to totally agree with Haneen, but let me just add that the solution to the unemployment problem in the Arab world has to be through enlarging the economies. You have to enlarge the economy, and then there's a place for all. But if we look at the size of the economy as stagnant and at AI replacing traditional jobs, then we would still have a problem. And enlarging the economy involves necessarily, paying attention to gender equality. There is a mistaken notion in the Arab world that if women go in the workforce, they're going to replace jobs for men. What is not understood is that you enlarge the economy when women go in, and that has benefits for both women and men. We need, once again, to change the overall mindset with which we are approaching development problems.
Thank you so much, Marwan. So basically, we need to revamp the whole political and economic system. They are both interconnected. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for today's panel. I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for joining us today and for discussing in 1 hour very big questions concerning the global economy and specifically the economy in the MENA region. Thank you so much for joining us. And we tried to, in 1 hour, to discuss new geopolitical and geoeconomic realignments happening, but also discuss specifically the new economic order and political order that the MENA region should be or could be heading towards. Thank you so much for the virtual audience who also joined. I hope you found this discussion enriching, and I look forward to having more of these discussions with Carnegie scholars next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.